You're watching another episode of Unprecedented with Michael Popok and I, and we have quite a bit to talk about in terms of the Constitution and the Supreme Court. First off is Lisa Cook. As we know, Trump has been trying to fire her. She's a member of a governor of the Federal Reserve, and he has lost at the lower court level. He has asked the Supreme Court to allow her to be removed while the case is pending. We have the brief both from him and Lisa Cook, both arguing their cases. And in addition, we're going to talk about free speech because, of course, we see that tax on free speech, both what is happening with the FCC chair, Brendan Carr, getting Jimmy Kimmel off of the air, perhaps other opinions and personalities on TV that they don't like, trying to get them off the air as well. What has the Supreme Court said on almost exactly this issue? They've ruled unanimously in 2024. We'll talk about that, as well as we're going to talk about this difference between incitement to violence and hate speech, because as we know, Attorney General Pam Bondi just this week said she plans on criminalizing hate speech, and she conflates it with incitement to violence. Justice Sotomayor, out on her book tour, had something to say about that as well. So good to see you, Popok. How's your day going?
It's going great. Thanks for doing the intro for Unprecedented. Let's dive right in. We got a new filing by Lisa Cook, right?
Yes,
Dina. So the Lisa Cook won already at two levels. She won at the trial court level with Judge Cobb, demonstrating that Donald Trump's attempts to fire her on the Board of Governors for the Federal Reserve was not done properly with for cause. We'll talk about what for cause means, and was done without regard to her due process rights under the Fifth Amendment. It then went up on appeal by Donald Trump to the D.C. Appellate Court, Federal Appellate Court, and she won again, 2-1. There, they narrowed the appeal issues down to due process, arguing that, well, we really don't have to touch on whether this is cause or not for cause, because she didn't get her due process. I mean, a mean tweet by Bill Pulte, Donald Trump's attack dog at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and her not responding for 5 days is not the equivalent of a hearing on due process and her ability to defend herself before her 13 years remaining on the Federal Reserve is ripped away from her. And so that was their ruling, 2-1, with a Trumper Katsas in dissent. Donald Trump doesn't take the emergency appeal, and we thought exactly because the ruling that I just described happened the day before the Federal Reserve's Open Market Committee was meeting, which was Wednesday, to set rates in America, interest rates in America. She got to participate in the meeting and voted along with 11 other members of the Open Markets Committee. All 12 voted for a rate cut because of Donald Trump's tragedy of an economy. One of his newly appointed members, Stephen Mirren, who still sort of works in the White House, he thinks the economy is doing even worse than others, and he voted for a deeper cut. But the rate cut thing happened. She's in her job. She's doing her job. She's not like she's out of her job trying to get back in. She's in her job, and he's trying to take her out. And that matters from the perspective of what we call status quo. So they filed it, and finally they get around to yesterday filing their emergency application to the United States Supreme Court for Stop John Roberts on the shadow docket, which is this short, constrained, short-circuited thing that we all hate, which is not full briefing, not full oral argument on some narrow, sometimes procedural grounds, but on very important issues. So it gets up to Roberts, and what happens next?
Yeah. So basically, the essential argument, as you said, in terms of what Trump is trying to say to the Supreme Court was, one, Lisa Cook isn't entitled to due process. If she is entitled to due process, then Trump alone gets to decide what cause is. They go into the allegations of the mortgage fraud, which we know have essentially been debunked. But he said it doesn't really matter kind of if it's true or not, because he alone gets to decide it. This is part of his Article 2 powers. Of course, they reference that because we know the Supreme Court with the Trump immunity has really, I guess you could say, enshrined and protected this Article 2 unquestionable authority. So those, and then their third argument is, even if she's entitled to an equitable remedy, the equitable remedy isn't reinstating her to her office. Lisa Cook really in her filing didn't even mention the mortgage fraud.
Well, talk about why there's a filing and what is it over?
Well, they want the lower court order to be, which kept her in the office. They want that to be removed. They want her removed now. This is, again, this preliminary injunction, administrative stay. Trump doesn't like it. He doesn't want to wait for the litigation to go forward to decide whether or not she's removed or not. He wants her removed now. So that's what they're asking the Supreme Court to go in and reverse.
Right. And so Judge Roberts gave, just on this narrow issue, but really subsumes the entirety of the debate. He gave the other side until 4 o'clock, the Cook side, until 4 o'clock today to fully brief him on whether he and the rest of the court are going to grant the administrative stay, which would take her out of her job, which she's already in, right? Upending the status quo, while they decided the merits of the case on an emergency application. So it's like an appeal issue. It's a stay issue within an appeal issue. But the result would be that if they had the votes to take her out, which is extraordinary for a Supreme Court to take somebody out of a job they just did on Thursday, in order, which would signal that they're going to allow Donald Trump to ultimately get rid of Lisa Cook, if they think that he is likely to prevail, even though the status quo would be disturbed, that would be the signal if they were to rule that way. So we've got her briefed. It came in early. They weren't waiting around till 4 o'clock. They got it they got it in midday on Friday, and then and then we're waiting for Roberts and the court to decide. If they decide to grant the stay, and we'll update this because this is a fast-moving story. I'll jump on a Substack Live or something if this thing comes in after this episode is cut, because these stories are fast-moving. We can't always catch them right at the right procedural moment. But if they do grant the stay and block the injunction and take her out of her job, that means they're going to ultimately rule that Donald Trump can remove her for cause, whatever he says it is, which is what they argued in their brief, that there is no judicial oversight over that, which would be extraordinary for the Supreme Court, to rule on that, which would, we'd have to then use as when we get the presidency in 2028. Everything, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. You're going to start making these rulings for Donald Trump. Trump's not going to be in office forever, even though sometimes he acts like he is.
Oh, such a good point. No, absolutely. And, and her response I thought was interesting. She doesn't even mention mortgage fraud in there at all. She goes all to economic stability, which is exactly the right argument with the Supreme Court. They have signaled in an earlier decision regarding the Wilcox case that, the Federal Reserve chair is different. They do not want economic instability. And interestingly, Lisa Cook also cites Brett Kavanaugh himself, knowing how much she needs his vote. So that was really her main focus was if they don't. And then another really interesting thing to the status quo, she said, Congress made sure the president doesn't govern the day-to-day of the Federal Reserve. So there's no urgency in getting rid of her now as Trump is trying to argue, because he doesn't have kind of control of their day-to-day operations in order for there to be stability and not for this to be political. I think that in this instance, I know you can't ever guess with these kind of legal things, but I think she will prevail here.
She might, but if not, we'll have to update you. I don't want to, it's hard to speculate with this, but the reason it's only on this issue is it went from two decisions by the trial judge, which were her due process rights were violated. And even if they weren't, Donald Trump didn't have the proper for cause as a basis to fire her, which was the mortgage fraud allegations, which have turned out to be not mortgage fraud at all, as we now know from new reporting. And then by the time it got to the appellate court below the Supreme Court, it gets narrowed. They uphold her, Judge Cobb, but only on the due process grounds. They say we don't have to address for cause. Now it goes to the Supreme Court. Now the case has shrunk down to due process, and the case law around whether a stay can disturb the status quo or not, which then leads Lisa Cook to kind of jump into this narrow box that's been created by the Supreme Court and Donald Trump by the shadow docket. And again, you might be saying, what about the big picture? And she's trying to argue the big picture by saying, don't take me out of my job. Status quo disturbed, that violates all of your case law about stays. But that's why the focus, you said before we got on, the brief was really brief. I said, yeah, it was, because they're really just on this narrow stay issue. And what Donald Trump is trying to do is trying to turn one vote into 9. If he gets Lisa Cook off, he gains control of the majority of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. And then in that capacity, he can then fire each and every one of the 12 regional presidents of the Federal Reserve banks, which gives him what he needs for the Federal Open Markets Committee, which is comprised of 5 rotating members off the Federal Reserve regional banks and the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, 7. So if he gets rid of Lisa Cook, it's not just Lisa Cook. It's that he picks up 9 votes, which is a majority on the 12-vote panel to set interest rates. Right now, he only controls 3 votes, Mirren, Bowman, and Waller. But if he gets rid of Lisa Cook, all those regional presidents like Goolsbee, Obama, in Obama's administration that runs Chicago, all those guys are gone. All those people are gone. And they're all replaced with people Donald Trump likes who would vote in line. So it's not just Lisa Cook. It's 9 votes if he can get rid of Lisa Cook, which is something I don't think the press and the media is focused enough on. Why don't we turn from Lisa Cook to Donald Trump's full-throated assault on the media and the First Amendment? Or as the New York Times put it today, Trump hits the media with everything he has, which is another chapter in the same playbook of go after big law, go after big universities, go after the Democratic Party, now go after what he sees to be liberal First Amendment expression that criticizes his administration, just like every dictator in every country hates the state-controlled speech thing is right out of the dictator's playbook. So today yesterday it's Stephen Colbert. It's the attack on the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, although as we came on the air, the New York Times suit was such a POS, as we've called it in legal terms, that the judge has already dismissed it, really without any other, on his own, sua sponte, dismissed it without the New York Times responding, because this was the $55 billion lawsuit against the New York Times Donald Trump filed in order to take away from some bad news cycle that was going on. So New York Times, Wall Street Journal is going to be fighting hard against their case. The attack on CBS through its parent company, Paramount, the attack on ABC through its through its parent company, Disney, the attack on Jimmy Kimmel through its parent company, Disney. And so what we're watching is, I think, based on the reaction of the American people, is that Donald Trump has overplayed his hand about the demise of Charlie Kirk. For him in MAGA, it was a great news cycle post Charlie's death, because they were able to create a martyrdom around him and try to use that to invoke policy to go after Democrats and liberals and moderates. But then he went too far, even in most people's mind, by pressuring Jimmy Kimmel and getting him off the air and pressuring Disney to boot. And now he's opened up a national conversation about First Amendment free speech and what that means in America. And everybody's coming off the sidelines to jump into this debate. Right? Let's show the clip of Donald Trump going after, using Jimmy Kimmel as a launch pad, a jumping off point to go after all media that criticizes the king. Let's run that clip.
Mr. President, are you going to ask Brendan Carr to weigh in on other late night hosts that you have asked that should be on the air?
Host is on network television. There is a licensing. I'll give you an example. I read someplace that the networks were 97% against me. I get 97% negative, and yet I won it easily. Won all 7 swing states, popular, but won everything. And if they're 97% against, they give me only bad publicity or press. I mean, they're getting a license. I would think maybe their license should be taken away. It will be up to Brendan Carr.
And then later, he tries to backpedal and say the reason Jimmy Kimmel was taken off was because it was the same reason Colbert was taken off. He's no talent. He doesn't get the ratings. Let's watch that attempt to reshape the story.
And what you'd like to see replace Kimmel on late night?
Well, a lot of people, anybody could replace him. The guy had no talent. He was fired. He had no talent. It's a whack job, but he had no talent. And more importantly than talent, he had no, because a lot of people have no talent, they get ratings. But he had no ratings. His ratings were worse than Colbert, I think.
Okay, so with that as a backdrop, talk about Pam Bondi deciding she wants to get in on the act. I want to pick up a pitchfork and a torch and go after Democrats too. What can I do from my perch on the Department of Justice? Why don't you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, and just before we move on, I mean, the Supreme Court has spoken on this, by the way. I mean, part of this is, people have asked or, discussed, whether or not they could have taken a stand, right? Nexstar and ABC. We know Nexstar did this because they wanted that $6.2 billion acquisition of Tegna to be approved by the FCC chair. They just entered into agreement a few short weeks ago. But technically, they have a very strong constitutional standing for anybody else. FCC chair is already talking about going after The View. I mean, this is just the beginning for these folks. So since this is a Supreme Court show, just to give us a primer on what the Supreme Court has said about almost this exact issue. It was just in 2024. It was the NRA versus Voyoy. I think I'm mispronouncing that. VULLO. Justice Sotomayor was the one that wrote the opinion, and it was a unanimous decision. And in that case, it was a New York insurance superintendent was found to have coerced the insurance company to stop doing business with the NRA based on the NRA's speech, almost exactly to the point of these facts. And let me just tell you, they came up with a 4-factor test that if you think about what Brendan Carr, the FCC chair, and also Trump is saying about canceling the licensing, I cannot think of a more on-point fact pattern. One, the word choice and tone and how much of an authority they have, the speaker. There you go. The FCC has it. The existence of regulatory authority. Okay. Broadcasting license. There's the authority. Whether the government speech was perceived as a threat. I mean, they are making it very clear that they plan on going after licenses of people who are speaking negatively about Trump, and whether the government speech refers to the adverse consequences. So they meet those 4-factor tests, which makes it even worse that these private companies are willing to bend the knee, obey in advance, because this isn't a gray area. They have a constitutional right. Jimmy Kimmel has a constitutional right to his speech, and ABC, whatever they want to put on their platform, as long as it's protected free speech, which it clearly was. And the Supreme Court has just spoken again unanimously. So just so all of us on Unprecedented know, and when we speak about this, because this is going to be, as you said, Popok, in the national conversation going forward. The other part was Justice Sotomayor and Attorney General Pam Bondi almost had like a conversation this week, because Pam Bondi went out and put out a statement saying that she plans on going after hate speech. Of course, they're all talking about the left's hate speech, but she cites instead a criminal statute that goes toward incitement to violence. And Justice Sotomayor comes back and says, clearly, you as an attorney, I mean, we have our opinions about Pam Bondi, but she's a lawyer. She knows the law. She's purposely conflating the two. And Justice Sotomayor says, you clearly know that hate speech is protected speech. And so just so we all are on the same page, again, this is a Supreme Court show. Let's know what the Supreme Court precedent is. The case is Brandenburg, and that is the case that says that incitement to violence is not protected free speech. Hate speech, as much as we don't like it, as much as it offends us, is protected free speech. But in terms of incitement to violence. That's what's not protected. And it is a very particular type of speech. It has a two-part test. Don't you love these tests and factors, Popok? But the two-part test on that, you have to intend to produce imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce some action. So a pretty high standard for what is unconstitutional speech that can actually be prosecuted. But Pam Bondi, Trump clearly trying to criminalize speech they don't like.
Yeah, I had ACLU's director, Ben Weiser, yesterday on, and the interview has been going up this weekend, who's in charge of the Democracy Project and all First Amendment issues. And he said they don't expect to win these prosecutions or these cases, but their goal is to have an interim chilling effect on speech and to make media companies who are interested in their bottom line bend the knee, even though if these cases ever end up at the United States Supreme Court for Donald Trump, they would inevitably lose. Just like he knows that Trump knows the New York Times case was never going to win. That wasn't its purpose. It was to grab the headlines away from a drowning Kash Patel at the House and Senate Judiciary Committees about the Epstein and Kirk matters, about his failed royal visit. So what do we got on the shelf? Let's file the suit against the New York Times. Good timing. But Sotomayor, ears perked up. They're all still on their summer vacation a little bit until they hit the bench on October 7th for the new term. And she happened to be at New York Law School. And while she was at New York Law School after Bondi made the comment, she made the following criticism or critique of Pam Bondi and where she went to law school. Let's play that clip.
And the thing that gets to me is every time I listen to a lawyer-trained representative saying we should criminalize free speech in some way, I think to myself, that law school failed. All right? If any student who becomes a lawyer hasn't been taught civics, then the law school has failed. It should be as critically a part of the curricula as your first year courses.
I mean, Sotomayor is out there, man, taking on all comers on these particular issues. But the reason that we're spending so much time on that is because Donald Trump has decided to use Charlie Kirk's death as an act of martyrdom to then use it to implement his desires to crush the Democratic Party. He's going after Act Blue, the fundraising arm of the Democratic Party. He's going after states and their secretaries of state about the voting rolls. He's already collected 30 million voting records from states that have cooperated with him. He's gotten places like Berkeley, of all things, talk about the liberal bastion of education, to supply him with 166 names. I feel like
so scary stuff.
Faculty and students who maybe participated in some sort of anti-Semitic, maybe First Amendment protected speech on campus, and got Berkeley to bend the knee under all of these threats, taking away grants, And so this will ultimately, hopefully, end up at the Supreme Court. Right. And the reality is that if these media companies that control ABC and CBS and Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, if they would just go to federal judges, they would get the right result based on the case law. Even at the Supreme Court, I think they would get the right result, but they are living in fear, like, for instance, Jimmy Kimmel. The reason Jimmy Kimmel's off the air has nothing to do with Jimmy Kimmel's comment. The reason Jimmy Kimmel's off the air is because ABC is embroiled in a $6.2 billion transaction with its affiliates to acquire another 60 TV stations around the country. And the main company is pissed off at Jimmy Kimmel. And so they ordered ABC to take Kimmel off the air because they need the FCC, Donald Trump's Brendan Carr, who's one of the architects of Project 2025, to give them regulatory approval.
And that's the thing. It's not even just fear. It's greed that's driving them. Like, I almost think fear is giving them a little bit too much credit. They want those deals to go through. They don't want to lose money. You can talk about this with everybody that's bent the knee. The law firms, they clearly had a right too, but they didn't want to lose maybe clients, but they lost clients. Disney evidently is losing millions of dollars of people subscribing them. And it's the only way to combat greed is to say, well, okay, you make that choice, you're going to lose money this way too. But I mean, I think that this is just another example of the consolidation of wealth and power. TikTok, same thing. Trump is going to approve the sale to Larry Ellison, right? We see what he and his son have done with CBS. And then also Mark Andreessen, his private equity, who was, according to the Washington Post, in some What's Group over the summer, saying that elite universities have to pay the price. And now all of a sudden he's going to be in charge of the algorithm for young people. This is why we have to bring back politics, like get money out of politics. We have to tax the billionaires because the consolidation of wealth and power is getting, so obvious. We cannot ignore the ramifications of it for our democracy.
And I like what the Senate Democrats are doing, proposing the NOPE bill against targeting political speech. Even though the First Amendment already provides that protection. However, they're adding a legal defense fund attached to it and is saying, you want to go after these people, go after them. But we're going to end up paying for their defense because that's the only way to hit them where they live is to say you're going to end up paying to defend these people in court should they be hit with prosecutions that are unconstitutional. We'll see where that bill goes, but at least the Democrats, I think what we're watching in the shadow of the Supreme Court about to reopen is we're watching the Democratic leadership regaining their footing and regaining their messaging about what role they should be playing here post Kirk. There's a pre-Kirk and there's a before Kirk and an after Kirk, and we can't ignore that it happened, but we also have to see how we can leverage Donald Trump's overplaying his hand to try to crush dissent and try to once again, the overarching theme here is Donald Trump wants to ruin and wreck the Democratic Party and its brand. Yeah. He's going after its leaders. He's going after, the Obamas, the Clintons, the Schiffs. I'll restart that. He's going after the Obamas, the Clintons, the Schiffs, the Letitia Jameses, the Lisa Cooks of the world, with phony allegations of fraud and crimes. And Biden and all of that, he's trying just to a dictator wants many things, but certainly wants complete state control over speech. And if he can only have one party in the country, that's good too. And that's what we're watching. Donald Trump's playing out of that particular playbook, trying to do maximum damage before the midterms. And then we're going to have to spend an entire 2 terms to fix it all. But we will. We will. We're bigger than they are. We are bigger than they are. We always have to remember that. The body politic is bigger than the MAGA party. And we just have to get into a position at the ballot box. I know people are chomping at the bit to start voting. If they could vote now, Donald Trump would already be out of office, or at least he'd be lame duck. But we got to wait I think it's a year from coming up. It's a year from November, I guess. Thank God, 6 months, right? It's a year. Something like that.
Although you could argue that this November's election in California regarding the 5 congressional seats might be the most important election of them all. Yeah. So if you're in California, if you're outside California, there's phone banks and all sorts of stuff you can do with help with that election if you're chomping at the bit and looking for something to do.
Absolutely. Well, we're still teeing up the new Supreme Court term. But covering for new emergency docket filings that have been filed at an extraordinary pace. Donald Trump's winning those 84% of the time, although he's losing 90% of the time in the courts below. And there's that tension, that existential fight for the soul of our rule of law and of the Supreme Court. And we'll see what happens next. Follow it on Unprecedented. And for some of these stories that are moving so quickly, click on here, subscribe to Legal AF, the YouTube channel. And then come over to Legal AF Substack, where you'll see amazing writing by people like Dina. You'll see live. I do live reports twice a day. If something happens in one of the matters we're talking about here, I will have done something about it on Legal AF Live or Substack Live. And if you want to become a full-fledged member of the Legal AF community, it's Legal AF, the YouTube channel, Legal AF, the podcast, and Legal AF, the Substack. And then you are a card-carrying member of Legal AF. Dina, so great to see you again for our weekly show. Any final thoughts?
No, so glad to be doing this with you. I feel strangely hopeful in the midst of really a horrible week for democracy and free speech. But the law is on our side. And as you say, the people are on our side, and we can't forget that. They want us to forget it. We just keep moving forward and wait for those midterms, as you said.
Absolutely. Dina Dahl and Michael Popok for Unprecedented, only on Legal AF YouTube channel. Shout out to the Midas Mighty and the Legal AFers. Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.